Welcome to the campus of North Idaho College and today's broadcast of the North Idaho College Public Forum. The crew is comprised of North Idaho College television students. Your moderator is North Idaho College political scientist, Tony Stewart.
Today we wish to discuss with you the concept of hospice. We're going to do this in a different way than we have done one time before on this program. We're not going to talk about hospice in a local perspective, but rather on a rather global one. Hospice has been quite well known and popular in England and has spread to the United States in the past 10 years, has grown rapidly throughout this country. In order to cover that area, we wish to deal with the historical development and what's happening now, and on a contrasting way talk about hospice in these two countries, and last we'll look at the future of hospice. In order to accomplish this, we're going to stress very heavily a publication entitled The Hospice Movement from the viewpoint of an anthropologist, Mr. Eric Anderson, who did this as a senior work at the University of Montana before entering graduate school. And to somewhat critique that and to also give their own viewpoints, we have two guests. First of all, we have Father Nat Pierce, who is with Grace Episcopal Church in Nampa, Idaho, and his wife Audrey is also with us as a guest. They have particular expertise in that they have been involved, and Audrey is a volunteer with hospice in southern Idaho. And during a sabbatical by Father Pierce, they went to England and Wales earlier this year and studied hospice in that part of the world. We're very happy to have both of you with us today. I'm happy to welcome to the panel to question our guests today. First of all, regular panelists, Mary Lou Reed, and our second panel member is Kay Magruder, who is the coordinator for Hospice of North Idaho Incorporated. We shall commence the questioning with Lou Reed.
Father Pierce, do you have a ready definition of hospice on the tip of your tongue?
Hospice is concerned primarily for families where one member of the family has a limited life expectancy. And therefore, I would define hospice as being concerned primarily about life.
That's very helpful. That sets the background. And now let's take you to the birthplace of hospice, which you just visited along with Audrey. I think that was St. Christopher's in London?
Yes.
Could you give us a little bit of the historical perspective of hospice? How did it begin?
It began with Cicely Saunders, who really went through the difficulties of watching a friend die with inadequate medical care. And she set out to change that, and she went to medical school, got her credentials, then trained at St. Joseph's, which was founded by the Roman Catholic Irish Sisters of Charity in South London, and then raised the money and built St. Christopher's to do three things. One, provide first-rate care for those who have a limited life expectancy. Secondly, to do credible research that would change the way health care systems dealt with the terminally ill. And thirdly, to train other people to go back and do good hospice work in their own local situations.
And how rapidly has this caught on?
In England, very rapidly. In the United States, very rapidly. There's no hospices we know of in France and Germany, and some in the Scandinavian countries. But it is definitely a growing phenomenon here in the States.
Thank you.
Kay Magruder.
Is there a reason why it is not in those countries, and in the United States there seems to be, in a nuclear family that we have extended to beyond the extended family, is there some cultural reasoning why that is so?
Well, maybe both Audrey and I ought to take a crack at this one. My sense of why it spread so rapidly here is because we have a need to care for other people in a one-to-one way, and in terms of what's happening in our society, that's less and less viable. I think we need to look more carefully at why people want to work in hospice, but I think one of the principal reasons is the great reward of helping others in need. We're sort of rediscovering each other, if you will. But you take a crack at that. Why do you think it's growing here in the United States? Why are you a volunteer?
Oh dear, I'm a volunteer because I had a friend who died of cancer, and without the help of hospice, and it was a very difficult situation. I think that with the advent of Kubler-Ross's book, people are more willing to talk about death. People are more willing to face their dying, and hospice is one way of helping families attain this goal.
I think we should get a little bit more background of what's happened. I mentioned on the beginning of the program, or at the beginning of the program, that there's been this very rapid growth. Father Pierce, you did indicate that England was the birthplace, but compared with the dates of when that started in 1970 or so in the United States, compared to today, show us the growth rate. What kind of statistics are we looking at?
Well, now that I can't tell you, other than I can tell you this. The National Hospice Organization, that's the countrywide United States national organization, had its first organizational meeting in 1977, I believe, and we were there in 1982, and there must have been, what, 2,500 people there from all over the United States. They started, I think, with 177, and now they're at 2,500 in 1982, representing hospice work from all over the United States, and what, 4 of us went from Nampa to that meeting. It's beyond that, I didn't come prepared to say how many hospices there are.
But that is remarkable growth in 10 or 12 years.
Yes.
Yes. Lou Reed.
Well, what are some of the contrasts that you see between the way that England is taking its hospice program and the way it's developing in the United States? What struck you both as being very strikingly different?
I think the two main differences between how hospice is developing in England and how it is developing here is that in England, the hospice facility is the main thing. They have in-house, in-patient facilities for the people with limited lifespans. And here in the United States, it tends more towards the home care, home, death at home kind of situation. The other thing is the bereavement follow-up programs that they have in England are very different from what we have here in that, do you want me to go for?
Yes, please do.
In that, in the United States, usually the volunteer is the person that follows the family after the death of the patient and will do the bereavement follow-up. And the bereavement follow-up can last for as long as 2 years, maybe even longer if it's required. In England, they have specifically trained bereavement people, visitors, who will make maybe 2 or 3 visits to a family, and that will be basically what their follow-up is, unless other kinds of services are required. They do follow the anniversary date, but usually it's 2 or 3 visits.
Let's talk a little bit more about the whole question of institutionalization as opposed to death at home. Why do you suppose that has developed that way in England, and do you feel that the United States is going in the right direction in taking it away from the institution into the home? That's kind of a leading question, wasn't it?
Yes.
I feel very strongly that the home is a better setting, at least personally and as professionally as a clergyman, for someone to die. The hospital is not. Hospitals are there to save lives and to help people become well again, and they, by and large, do not cope well with someone who is terminally ill, although I think there's been some improvement on that score, generally speaking. But certainly, I think part of the reason why England has gone the route of building all these buildings is because of the whole question of socialized medicine versus non-socialized medicine. I think and you could have a whole panel discussion on that, but the whole orientation of the English healthcare delivery system is towards that kind of stuff, buildings and equipment and trained people.
So there's some economics involved here that's beneficial for the institutions to promote their continued life.
Absolutely, and whereas here in the States, you see, the interesting thing about hospice is the heavy use of volunteers, and we heard over and over again in England how impressed the people in England are with the way people in the States, programs in the States, use volunteer help. And now, instead of the English coming over to the States, they kind of look to Americans going to England and helping them learn how to train volunteers and utilize them in the hospice program. We make much better use of volunteers here in the United States for really hands-on care with, in conjunction with family members and the hospice nurse.
Maybe we can come back to that later, but I think I probably should give Kay a chance.
In your travels, both of you, have you found that there is a common philosophy about dying in England and wherever we are in the United States? Is there a common philosophy in?
Well, I think that most definitely there's a common philosophy. I mean, in the hospice movement, part of the guidelines that were set up were adopted by the National Hospice Organization. Cicely Saunders set certain guidelines that would be the criteria for calling yourself a hospice. I think in England, as in the United States, there was a definite reluctance to talk about death, and they treat death pretty much the same way that we treat death here. It's all glossed over, and people are reluctant to talk about it. Families go through the funeral process, and that's basically you should be over your grief and get on with your life kind of situation. And I think that in England that this is true also.
I think
whether
that
it's the Anglican
I think I'll read that you might have built a bridge for us. I want to do some questioning in relation to the thesis that I mentioned at the beginning of the program that was the senior paper that was done at the University of Montana. And when I read it, I was very impressed. And one of the reasons that I think I came away with such an positive impression of the work itself, not only had many hours gone into it and much documentation, but Mr. Anderson indicated in his study that we have, if I'm reading him correctly, we have a great problem in this country with death. We don't cope well with it. The family doesn't cope well. Even the institutions, I thought he did it in the most positive way, but he indicated that there are a number of institutions in our society that don't deal with it very well for the family. And out of that, he explained some of those problems and indicated that hospice might be a vehicle that could aid not only the family but society in general and the institutions in coming to somewhat of a new concept of how to deal with the process that takes place and how to deal with it after. I think what Audrey's getting at. My question, Reverend Pierce, would be to you, I think, that is, since you have had an opportunity and an advantage point looking at it from both sides and being a religious leader, would you agree or disagree that we have problems in how we deal with it in the family and in society and in institutions?
Absolutely. In fact, the two professions that have the most difficulty in dealing with death are clergy and doctors. A lot of documentation to indicate this, even some suggestions that people become doctors and clergy as a way of trying to beat death or avoid dealing with death. And I think that issue has come out of the closet now, and we're being challenged to do more than give rote answers or superficial answers to real questions, and to deal with situations where maybe there are no answers, but other than being there and caring.
Well, when you say that we have not dealt with it well and we have problems, could you be more specific? Are we looking at death wrong, or are we saying the wrong thing to those people who need a different type of support, or is it in our value system, are we, even as growing up, are we not talking about it in the proper way?
Well, listen to people talk about death sometime. You know, when my husband passed away, well, he didn't pass away. When I lost my mother, you didn't lose your mother. I mean, you know, your mother died. But very hard to use those words. I think the problem has to do with the American definition of success. We're all under enormous pressure to be successful. And the successful person lives a long, happy, rewarding life. And when death comes, particularly, let's just start with the medical profession, death is a sign of failure. And I don't think hospice has a death philosophy per se. I think what hospice tries to say is that death is a normal part of life that can be as meaningful as other parts of life. One of my good friends who's a poet says, when the time comes for me to die, I want to be sure to be awake because I don't want to miss anything. It's something to be experienced and not something necessarily to be feared. And part of the problem is that, of course, he quotes the Amish in here, and I think the Amish are an excellent example, but he misses the whole point of what the Amish are all about. The Amish really believe that death is part of life, and they live it, and therefore they don't have that problem. I don't think Americans, by and large, believe in anything except themselves, success, and technology, and those things are reaching their limits when we talk about death.
Let's pursue that just a little bit further. You indicated that in his study, when he talked about the Amish, how they deal with death,
Yep.
and how the other families come in and support them and do everything during that process. But you're indicating that they're not looking at that as death, but an extension of life.
Exactly.
Would you elaborate?
Death, to them, death is a natural part of their existence here, and they have a faith perspective that enables them to cope with that. Americans, on the other hand, tend to be very shallow in their religious convictions, and he mentioned this in here, but he never really makes the connection between our shallow faith and the deep religious commitment that the Amish have to their own.
And that's a major contrast.
To me, that's the major issue for them, you see. And hospice believes in something. Hospice believes in helping people and supporting them where they are. And this is why hospice is so exciting, because it's almost a new idea for Americans, I think.
Do I gather something here, and then I'll go back to the panel? The Amish do it from very deep religious beliefs. Hospice, I happen to be a board member of hospice and work with others, and although there's this dedication that you're talking about for service and maybe a different concept of the issue of death, but it doesn't base all of its work on the same kind of principle the Amish do. In other words, in hospice you have a great variety of people working religious and non-religious. So is there more than one way to approach this?
Absolutely, and some people come to it from a religious perspective. What really touched Audrey was the death of her friend a number of years ago, but it's interesting in England to see where religious faith has had a dramatic impact on hospice work. We think of, well, Sister Frances Dominica, who started Helen House, the first hospice for terminally ill children in England. And a nun did this, the superior of a religious order, and almost single-handedly. And Mercy Hospital in Nampa is a Roman Catholic hospital, and they started their hospice 5 years ago. But that's not the only way. But I celebrate people who come into this out of a religious perspective, but I think others come in with as much authenticity from other perspectives, yes.
Lou Reed.
Well, even without a religious perspective, I think hospice is stressing spiritual values, is it not? I mean, the whole question of spirituality and the essence involved in the individuality of a person is something that hospice is.
Yes.
It feels as an underlying value. Is that correct?
I think hospice tries, not so much stressing it as honoring it and encouraging people to talk it through. That'd be a little bit better way to phrase that.
And we let the family, if they are involved in any religion, we let the family talk about their religion and talk about their ideas of death without making any value judgments. Now, we have some fundamentalist patients, and we have Mormons, and we have Roman Catholics, and we have, I don't think we've had any Jewish.
But the full spectrum.
But we're there just to support them in whatever religion they may be involved with.
And sometimes they're there to pick up the pieces, like when a clergyman comes in and tells the mother of a terminally ill child that the child is dying because of his sins, and that needs to be straightened out. I mean, those kinds of things actually go on.
There's some very shattering things that are done where you have to do some fast mending. Isn't honesty another value that hospice is attempting to foster? Because not only in the avoidance pattern that we have toward death, we tend to not be very straightforward at all. And is this part of the credo is that you are going to deal as honestly as possible with the family and with the patient about the realities? Would you like to respond?
That's exactly right. If the family wants to know what to expect, with the patient or how the disease may progress, we certainly are very honest with them, and we don't pull any punches.
Do you run into arguments with physicians, nurses, other members of the family in which honesty is something that is not easily dealt with?
Yes. Yes, we do. But I must say that, again, hospice is there to support the family wherever they are. And if their policy is not to talk about the coming death, then we do not force it on them. We don't go in and say, how do you feel today, or about dying. It's up to them to bring up those kinds of things if that's where they are. And many families do want to talk about death, and then I've been involved with families that are in the denial stage and don't particularly...
And they just may not be ready for it.
Right.
Maybe this is a good opportunity to emphasize, I think, a major distinction of hospice care. In hospice care, the unit of care is the family, of whom the patient happens to be but one member. And in your hospitals, it's precisely the reverse, isn't it? The unit of care in a hospital is the patient. And the family, if anything, is an annoyance in terms of staying there too long or getting too involved or asking too many questions. So it's almost a reversal in terms of who is caring for whom. And it's that family component that I think is so important, because death does bring families together at a very sensitive and difficult time in their lives, and to have a support, someone saying we care about that, is so helpful.
And to make it an opportunity, is that correct?
For growth and life, and in Christian theology we would call it resurrection.
Okay, Ruth.
Do you find that there is any cultural changes affecting, or that hospice is affecting? Here in the United States, has it been that long of time that there have been any inroads to change the culture in which we live today? Or is that something that those that are in hospice foresee in the future?
I'm not sure which is going first and who's leading whom, but I think the general proposition that's really up for grabs in vast segments of our culture is, how do you define success? What does it mean to be a successful person in this era? We have young people who are forgoing the traditional career pattern and getting involved in a lot of causes. We have the business executive who's saying, no, I won't move just to climb the corporate ladder. We have people saying, please do not take extraordinary measures to prolong my life. It's not worth that kind of effort. I'm ready to die. We have others saying, what does it mean to win the arms race with the Russians, and will we know if we ever get there? All these questions are surfacing, and I think we're beginning to realize that we need to deal with the question of meaning as opposed to quantity or status, that there's a real lack of meaning in a lot of where we are right now. And I think in that sense, hospice is sort of beginning to open up some possibilities. Hospice doesn't offer the answer. Hospice offers people a chance to grow if they want to, if they're ready for that. Patient and caregiver, I think.
So are you saying then that possibly hospice is not meant for everyone, and everyone won't feel comfortable within the program?
Oh, sure.
Oh, that's true. Very true.
The patient has to ask to be admitted into a hospice program. No one's forced in.
And the doctor has to recommend.
Give us an example of a type of patient or family that would not feel comfortable with hospice. Oh,
the person who decides they're going to go to the Bahamas, like Carter's sister did, you see, and there's some magical cure down there, and it's a matter of going down and getting the right people, the right combination of vitamins or whatnot, and who aren't accepting it, but who are determined that the medical profession here in the United States is hiding some special cure. What's that stuff you could take that was
Laetrile.
Laetrile, for example, you know? We're going to just go pursue that. That kind of person is not disposed to hospice, where the assumption is you are dying, but somehow that's going to be, the time you have left is going to be enormously meaningful to you and your family, and let's help make it so.
That gets into the paper, too, that we've been discussing, and he has a section dealing with cultural changes. We've been hitting at that some in the presentation already. With your expertise now and experience in the field, could you give our audience some concept of how this may make major cultural changes? You've mentioned about the concept of success and all that, but I'm speaking on a very personal basis between individuals and families and so forth. Could you give us some specific examples where you think change may come in our whole value system? What I'm attempting to do is to try to make it a little bit more concrete or specific rather than quite as general or philosophical.
Well, one specific change I foresee coming is helping doctors and clergy become more human, more integrated, if you will. Another change I foresee coming eventually is that the doctor will recognize the clergy person and what they stand for as an essential component of healing. I think most doctors really don't think much of spirituality and religion, and my sense is that we're coming into an era where we're going to rediscover the importance of that in the healing process.
I'd like to follow this up with a question to Audrey. Audrey, I've experienced this in some meetings we've had, and I think you mentioned this last night to a local hospice board. There are a lot of people working together of very diverse backgrounds, and some are religious and some aren't, and from many different economic spheres. And I find that this particular organization and concept brings people together in a very unique way. Do you find that to be true in Napa in your organization, and even in the visiting to England? Does it do something to the people who are involved, or does a special kind of person come in the first place? Is there a kind of harmony and tranquility that one doesn't find in some institutions and organizations?
Most definitely it does. The group that I'm involved with probably never would have gotten together in any kind of context, in a social or even political, or we never would have all met. I mean, it's a very diverse group, and but I'd like to say that the growth that the volunteer and the gifts that the families give to the volunteers far outweighs anything that we can do for individual families. It's just amazing.
So it's a very, very special experience.
And I want to say something about the cultural thing. I think
in about 20 seconds.
Oh, okay. In 20 seconds?
Yes.
Oh, well, Cicely Saunders' hope is that hospice will be phased out in 50 years, that there will no longer be a need for hospice.
Because it will go throughout the society.
Exactly.
Very interesting. And with that, I have to bring the program to conclusion. And I really want to thank you for being here. You were kind to come, and I commend you for the services you're providing to many people in this area. I thank the panel, too, for their outstanding questions. Ladies and gentlemen, our guests have been Father Nat Pierce and his wife Audrey from Napa, Idaho, dealing with the issue of hospice. I hope you've enjoyed our program and that you'll be with us again next week at this very same time, when we'll deal with a topic that we believe to be significant, and we hope you agree. Please have a good week. I am Tony Stewart.
The North Idaho College Public Forum can be seen at this same time each week over this station. This production was videotaped earlier by a North Idaho College student crew for viewing at this more appropriate time.